Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Off the Podium, where I get the chance to interview members of the orchestra, our patrons, other leaders of the arts, and other folks who make all of the performing arts work for us in LaGrange. So I'm delighted today, and very conveniently, to be joined by my wife, Sasha, who, amongst many other things, is the LaGrange Symphony Orchestra's principal oboe, and has been for a number of years now. So welcome to the program, Sasha.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yes, and I should, for our audience, just point out that, in fact, she is downstairs and I'm upstairs in my studio. So this was the only way we could figure out how to do this. So anyway, I've always been curious, how did you get to choose the oboe of all of the instruments, and what drew you to that choice?
So I actually wanted to play the violin. I had started piano at age 5. My mother is a piano teacher, and she started me on piano, and then it was time to branch out to other instruments. And I said, I want to play the violin. And my mother had actually played the violin in high school and said, it's too competitive. Why don't you play the oboe? Because the oboe always gets a solo at the beginning of every concert, which she meant the tuning A, which is a scary moment for all oboists. But I had no idea what an oboe was. I think I was about 7 at that point. So I just said, okay. And my mom set me up with some private lessons with a local oboist, and we went from there. I mean, I didn't really choose the oboe, but I'm glad my mother did. And it's, I think, suited to me and my personality.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there are a couple of things to unpack there. I think what's interesting is the supply and demand of instruments. That you're absolutely right, of course, that there are many students who learn violin, and we're certainly blessed with a plethora of those in our chosen field. So. But of course that's also incredibly competitive, even though you need more of those in an orchestra. And of course we need on average 2, perhaps 3 oboists in the orchestra, certainly at LaGrange. So it's an interesting balance about the choices there and about how those play out. But I'm certainly glad that you chose the oboe. That does indeed seem to be a very good fit. And of course, you mentioned that your personality kind of suits the oboe more, and I think it's not something that necessarily many of our listeners will be aware of, but it does seem to be the case that you can, after a while, you can almost tell what sort of people kind of play what specific instruments. The personality of flute players, I think, is very different to that of oboists, or certainly even a nuance of a difference between a first violinist and a second violinist, or certainly a first violinist and a tuba player. You can sort of generally tell that there are kind of distinct personality traits there. It's quite fascinating.
I've always wondered whether we are attracted to the instrument that is more like our personality, or we become the personality of our instrument.
For sure. Well, I think one of the things to me that's always definitely shaped kind of the intensity and the behavior of oboists is, of course, the challenge of the craft of reed making. So tell us about that process and why that is so important.
Sure. Well, it's partly just the acoustical nature of the instrument, which is that the reed or the oboe is basically an amplification of the reed. So if you have a good reed, you sound good. If you have a bad reed, you either sound bad or you have to do more to make the bad reed sound good. So reed making it's like very detailed woodwork. So I don't think I have a piece of bamboo on my desk right now, but I can show it to you later. So reeds are made of a type of bamboo, and you can start from the very beginning of the process, which is to get just raw bamboo shafts, and you cut them down through several processes, and finally at the end of all of that pre-processing, there's the tying of the reed and the scraping of the reed, which gets very, very detailed. And reeds, oboe reeds are double reeds. So there's two blades that vibrate together, unlike a clarinet, which has one reed that vibrates against the plastic. So with double reeds, with oboe reeds, the actual reed part is thin or thinner than a piece of paper. And so you're working with a very sharp knife to shape that piece of bamboo, which every time you put it in water, it changes. Every time it dries, it changes. So yes, one of the personality traits of oboists is maybe being neurotic or detail oriented. And this is why, because you might have a great reed and you hope that it lasts, but it doesn't always. So I would say that most oboists spend half of their time practicing and half of their time making reeds. And it's very hard to not go more into reed making, because you'll think, oh, I'm sitting down to a practice session, and then you choose the wrong reed, or the reed doesn't do what you want it to do, and then it becomes a reed making session. Same thing with lessons, actually. So reed making it's a craft all on its own, and most professional oboists make their own reeds because, again, acoustical properties and also the way we play our instrument, everybody's mouth, everybody's embouchure and oral cavity is different. So we all need to make our own specifically personalized reeds.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I'm not sure it's something that on average somebody sitting in the audience would necessarily realize. So this is actually you having to consistently make a functional piece of your instrument, kind of on a pretty regular basis in order to play it. So it's like the equivalent of if you were a pianist, you would have to, kind of like, make all of the piano strings and put the strings in the piano, every few times that you played. I mean, it's pretty extensive. And as you say, the reed, if it's not a good reed or hasn't been crafted well, that really affects the quality of the sound, and you have to go back to the drawing board. So it's a very intense part of the process. So other than obviously depriving pandas around the world of their natural food source, this is something upon which you spend a great deal of time, and you use the word craft, and I think that very, very much is the case. I mean, it's an incredibly important part of the nuance of that instrument. So tell us a little bit about the history of the oboe, because again, there are many different types of oboes, in the same way that the clarinet family is pretty extended as well, and there are also other instruments, which sort of reminds me of a joke I made once in a class about the bassoon being the bass member of the oon family, and then to my horror found out that that was actually true, and there is such a thing as a tenor oon, which is like a small bassoon or bass oon. So I never made that joke again. But tell us a little bit about the oboe family.
Sure. So the oboe itself is in C, and that's the one that probably everyone is most familiar with. It looks like a clarinet, but it's not a clarinet. And then the English horn is the bigger cousin to the oboe, which plays an F. We also have bass oboes and a couple other bass double reed instruments that aren't used as much. The oboe d'amore, the oboe of love, which is an A, which if anybody came to the Bolero concert, there was an oboe d'amore in that concert. But yeah, I mean, the oboe is one of the oldest wind instruments in the orchestra. So when composers were starting to diversify their instrumentation, they started with oboes and horns, and only in really special festive movements. But before that, oboes were used pretty extensively in like royal, again, festive type celebrations or occasions. So if you think of Handel's Royal Fireworks and how it's very reedy in that piece, that's based on sort of French oboe and double reed bands, which every year there's a double reed society conference, and one of the traditions there is to have a double reed ensemble, which is anybody can join, and it's like hundreds of oboes and bassoons. So that's actually like a 100-year-old tradition that is continued today. But oboes were used outside because they were loud.
Right, and that is, yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the wonderful qualities, I think, of the oboe, that it sort of cuts through in a very sort of poignant, meaningful way as a voice in the orchestra, and it does have a very vocal quality to it, certainly to my ear. So, I mean, the different types of oboe that you mentioned, I mean, for clarification then, in the same way that if we look at the clarinet family, for instance, you're talking about, essentially the same timbre, or at least a similar timbre, but it's simply either, kind of at a higher kind of sort of region of pitch or lower region of pitch, just in the same way that in a choir it would break down as soprano, alto, tenor, bass. So what we're talking about is sort of lower voices of register in the oboe family.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and so and I forget. I mean, obviously sort of the English horn, which of course is neither English nor a horn, but there you are.
I can explain that if you'd like.
Maybe we'll come back to that. And the oboe d'amore, are lower voiced and that much more sort of richer sounds, arguably, than the oboe in C, which is sort of what we have in the orchestra as a standard member of the woodwind section. But are there smaller oboes that sort of go up more into the hyper soprano register?
I think there's a piccolo oboe. I mean, I'm a bit confused about whether it's actually used in music or whether it's like a training instrument for, really young oboists.
That would make sense. I'd be a little nervous about hearing a piccolo oboe, but anyway, no, fascinating. And just to go back to the reed again, for the benefit of our listeners who may not be double reed players, this is the same concept as you as a child when you may have put two blades of grass together or split a blade of grass and kind of blown through it to make that really high-pitched sound out in the countryside or something. I mean, that's essentially what you're doing when you kind of pass the air kind of through the double reed. Yes, it's causing that same vibration, and as you said, it amplifies that sound through the instrument, which of course is keyed for different pitches.
Yeah, so you get a lot of folk double reed instruments in Asian cultures, Middle Eastern cultures. There's a lot of oboes because they have a double reed, but maybe they don't have as many keys, or they don't play the same pitches that we do, or they play pitches in between, or semitones in between the pitches that we play traditionally as orchestral players. So so double reed instruments are very old. I mean, they're shepherd instruments.
Right.
From the beginning.
Yeah. So again, some of the earliest instruments that are in some form or another represented in many other cultures other than Western culture, which is how we sort of know it. I remember when I was in Egypt, there are several sort of like, kind of early reed instruments there that still play a prominent part in the culture of Egypt. But, so great. So you had mentioned our performance of Bolero, which featured an oboe d'amore in A, which is just pitched a little bit lower than the regular oboe, shall we say, or the oboe in C. So I was curious as to what are some of the more memorable performances that you have from having played with the LSO for the last several years?
Well, there are a couple that come to mind. Actually, the Women in Music concert, because we've been listening to that this week. That was a really unique concert because I think most of the orchestra had not played any of that music before, which was 3 pieces, an overture by Fanny Mendelssohn, a symphony by Florence Price, and sort of a short tone poem by Lily Boulanger, right? Or Nadia? Lily.
Lily.
Yes, okay. And yeah, there were really surprising and beautiful moments in all of those pieces. And so that was, it was just nice. It's nice to play music that you haven't played before and discover that you really enjoy it and that the audience enjoys it, and to put on a great performance of that. Definitely playing the Mozart concerto a few years ago was very memorable. This is a piece of music that's just so central to the life of an oboist. It's basically on 99% of all orchestral auditions. It's a piece that everybody who learns the oboe through college is going to learn at some point. It's by Mozart, so it's important in that way. But it was, yeah, just wonderful to play that as a piece of music rather than an excerpt or preparing it for an audition. So that was very memorable and enjoyable experience for me. And then also, for some reason, our performance of Appalachian Spring by Copeland. Yeah, just again, sometimes it's just a chemistry thing with the people who happen to be playing that concert, and the conductor, of course. And yeah, that was, again, for some reason, that may have been my first season with LaGrange, I'm not sure, but for some reason that concert and that piece stick out to me.
That's yeah, wonderful selection of pieces. So again, for the benefit of our listeners, the Women in Music concert that I also thoroughly enjoyed for much the same reasons. I don't think I knew any of those pieces and hadn't conducted them before, and they're just fabulous works, and really do deserve to be heard so much more, like so much music that is passed over, or there simply isn't enough room in programming. But that's actually the featured radio show coming up in a week or two, so our listeners will be able to revisit all of those works, and we're actually using the live performance recording for the radio show of those works. And another thing that you mentioned that caught my attention was Appalachian Spring, and it was the chemistry, or sometimes it's the chemistry with the other players in the ensemble, which I think is a very interesting point, that you could play multiple performances of the same piece with different orchestras and maybe not have quite the same kind of personal fulfillment out of that experience. And actually, for argument's sake, the audience may not kind of hear the same piece in the same way, with different personalities playing the different parts. I mean, it comes across almost as though if you were to go to see several different performances of the same Shakespeare play, you would have different actors portraying those roles, but it would come across differently because of that inherent chemistry. And it would obviously be different for the cast, and it would also be different for the audience. And I think that's something in music that quite often we overlook, that's what makes performance unique, is often the character that's brought to the music by the musicians themselves, and arguably through the conduit of the conductor, and also sometimes the cultural references of the audience itself and how they respond to what they're hearing. And it can be a remarkably different experience, yet as one of my composition teachers would say, the dots on the page, in other words the written music, is exactly the same, so why is this different? A fascinating property of music, I think, and one of the things that makes it a great art form. So I'm going to move us to our next bullet point here. I'm curious as to how you think being a musician, of course, and you've been a musician for most of your life, how has this shaped you in other parts of your life?
For some reason, the first thing that comes to mind is discipline. It does take a lot of self-discipline and self-motivation to be a musician. No one's going to play your instrument for you, or decide that you are, well, I guess sometimes you have people say, you should really pursue this, but really it's a very independent pursuit to become a musician and to get to the level where you can be competitive and play with people at that level where it's where you get paid, but also where it's worth it. And yeah, so definitely discipline. One of the things I've always loved about music, I mean, I love traveling just as something to do, but I've always felt like music is a way to travel, even if you're sitting at home. So just exploring composers of different cultures, and I always like to find out, you know, the context, maybe the historical context of a piece, why it may have been written at that time, what that composer was thinking or feeling. So I would say music has sort of opened up opened up my world in that way, and also allowed me to travel to Austria, Russia, Germany, some other places to perform. And that has been really interesting, just to see how other audiences react to music, and how music is or isn't embedded in a culture, classical music and other types of music as well. So yeah, and then I think just keeping an open mind in general as a person. I think, you know, as a musician, it's difficult if you say, I'm going to be the principal oboist of the New York Philharmonic, because that job may not come up in your lifetime. So just being open-minded about what opportunities can still be fulfilling while you pursue whatever you want to do. And yeah, I think in those ways, and it's hard to separate music from myself as well.
Yeah, no, I very much empathize with that. I've certainly thought and found the same things, that it provides great opportunities to travel. I mean, I've certainly been fortunate enough to do that as a conductor and a composer here and there. But seeing or experiencing music in different cultures, and as you absolutely said, how deeply or how differently that is situated within particular cultures. And I'm thinking primarily different European cultures right now, where everybody turns out for the ballet, or it's Saturday, so of course everybody's going to the symphony, because what on earth else would you be doing on a Saturday? So yeah, it's interesting how that translates. But also, just to be able to walk into a rehearsal hall, you don't speak the language, but you can rehearse, kind of Mahler 1 or your great Mozart symphony or something like that, and the connection is gestural, and there's a lingua franca there, I think, that kind of enables that interaction. And I think that again is why music's so incredibly unique in that sense, I feel, as an art form, because it connects you in that way and goes beyond the written or the spoken word. So fascinating. Well, and it's definitely a theme of our programs, either on the Joy of the Orchestra on Eagle 102.3 FM, or on this series off the Podium, that we are working on and passionately waiting for a pathway back to live performance, which I very much hope will happen sooner rather than later. But it's been a pleasure to have you join me on this week's program, and thank you for being my wife as well.
Thank you for having me.
So ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us for this week's program. We'll look forward to joining you with another guest next week. Sasha Prior, Principal Oboe of the LaGrange Symphony Orchestra, has been our guest this afternoon. Thanks so much for joining me, and look forward to joining me again next week.